May 8, 1945. The sun rose over the western Pacific like a wound opening in the sky, its light catching the steel bones of something impossible. Captain Toshio Nakamura stood on the deck of a damaged destroyer, his hands gripping the rail until his knuckles whitened. Before him, stretching across the endless blue where there should have been nothing but water and coral, lay a metropolis. Concrete runways intersected like the arteries of some vast mechanical heart. Warehouses the size of imperial palaces lined organized streets. Cranes swung through the air with the rhythm of temple bells. Ships, hundreds of them, crowded harbors that had not existed 18 months before. The captain's breath caught in his throat. This was not a base. This was not an outpost. This was a city, born from the ocean itself, pulsing with a life force he had been taught was impossible. The smell of diesel fuel and fresh paint carried on the wind, mingling with salt spray. Somewhere in the distance, American jazz music drifted across the water from a loudspeaker, incongruous and mocking in its cheerfulness. Nakamura closed his eyes, but the image remained burned into his retinas, a vision that contradicted everything he had been told about the war, about the enemy, about the very nature of what was achievable in the Pacific theater. The Caroline Islands, the Marshalls, the Marianas, these had been Japanese strongholds, coral atolls fortified with concrete and determination, meant to serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers guarding the approaches to the home islands. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had planned the Pacific strategy, he had counted on these island chains to create a defensive perimeter so vast, so remote, that the Americans would exhaust themselves trying to breach it. The distances alone seemed insurmountable. Thousands of miles of empty ocean separated each island group from the American supply lines. Even if the Americans could take these islands, conventional military wisdom held that they could never sustain operations there. The logistics were too complex, the supply lines too extended, the infrastructure too primitive. An army, after all, travels on its stomach and fights with ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Every bullet, every gallon of gasoline, every can of food would have to be shipped across an ocean that the Japanese Navy had once dominated. The Emperor's strategists had calculated that this simple fact of geography and logistics would make any American advance slow, costly, and ultimately untenable. They had been wrong about many things in this war, but this error in judgment, this catastrophic underestimation of American industrial capacity and engineering ambition, would prove perhaps the most psychologically devastating. What the Japanese officers expected was mud and misery. They expected the Americans to struggle as they themselves had struggled on Guadalcanal and New Guinea, where disease killed more men than bullets, where supply ships arrived irregularly, where soldiers went weeks with inadequate food and ammunition. They expected to see an enemy worn down by the same tropical hardships that had plagued Japanese forces, the dysentery, the malaria, the endless rain that turned everything to rot. They expected makeshift camps, temporary airstrips carved from jungle, soldiers living in tents and eating cold rations. This was the reality of Pacific warfare as they understood it. This was how armies operated thousands of miles from home. What they encountered instead shattered their understanding of war itself. When Japanese reconnaissance flights first reported the installations being built at Ulithi Atoll, at Eniwetok, at Guam and Tinian, the reports were dismissed as exaggerations. When captured documents and interrogations confirmed the scale of what the Americans were constructing, Japanese command assumed it was propaganda, psychological warfare designed to undermine morale. But as more Japanese soldiers were captured or surrendered in the war's final months, as more officers saw with their own eyes what the Americans had built, the truth became undeniable and incomprehensible in equal measure. Ulithi Atoll became the symbol of everything the Japanese military had failed to understand about their enemy. Before the American invasion in September 1944, Ulithi was nothing, a collection of coral islets surrounding a lagoon, inhabited by a few hundred Carolinian natives and a small Japanese weather station. Within weeks of its capture, the United States Navy transformed it into the largest naval base in the world. Not the largest in the Pacific, the largest in the world. The lagoon, protected by its coral reef, provided deep water anchorage for more than 700 ships simultaneously. American engineers dredged channels, built piers and dry docks, constructed floating workshops and repair facilities. They erected fuel storage tanks capable of holding millions of gallons. They built barracks, hospitals, recreation facilities, post offices, and churches. They laid roads and installed electrical grids. They brought in fresh water distillation plants. By early 1945, more than 6,000 naval personnel were permanently stationed there, supporting a fleet that dwarfed anything the Imperial Japanese Navy could field. Ships that would have required a voyage to Pearl Harbor or San Francisco for repairs could now be serviced at Ulithi, sometimes in a matter of days. The atoll became the staging ground for the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the launching point for carrier raids on the Japanese home islands themselves. It was not merely a base. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem of American power, dropped into the Pacific as casually as a chess piece onto a board. The historical record captures the stunned disbelief in the words of Japanese prisoners. A lieutenant commander captured at Okinawa, when shown photographs of Ulithi, insisted they were fabricated. "This is not possible," he repeated, according to the interrogation transcript preserved in the National Archives. "You cannot build this in the middle of the ocean. Where do the materials come from? Where do the workers come from? How do you feed them?" When told that the construction had taken less than 6 months, he fell silent. Another officer, a logistics specialist who had spent years coordinating supply lines for Japanese forces in the Pacific, studied the intelligence reports on American bases with the intensity of a priest reading a heretical text. "We were taught that the Americans were soft," he told his interrogators, his voice carrying the hollow note of a man whose worldview had collapsed. "That they loved comfort too much to fight a hard war. That they would lose patience and sue for peace. But this," he gestured at the documents before him, "this is not the work of a soft nation. This is something else entirely. This is power we did not know existed." The transformation in Japanese thinking came not all at once but in accumulating waves of impossible realities. The food was often the first crack in their ideological certainty. Japanese soldiers, many of whom had subsisted on reduced rations for months or years, who had supplemented their meager supplies with roots, grass, and occasionally bark, found themselves as prisoners eating better than they had at any point in the war. The Americans fed their prisoners the same rations their own troops received. Spam and canned peaches became symbols freighted with political meaning. One Japanese sergeant, held at a POW camp on Guam, wrote in a diary later captured by American intelligence, "Today they gave us ice cream. Ice cream, in the middle of a war, on an island that was jungle 6 months ago. I do not understand these people. What kind of nation ships ice cream to the front lines? What kind of war is this?" The ice cream was not a luxury or a special treat. It was standard issue, mass-produced in floating ice cream barges that accompanied the fleet. The Americans had determined that ice cream improved morale, so they industrialized its production and distribution, even in combat zones. To a Japanese military culture that prized austerity and sacrifice, that celebrated spiritual strength over material comfort, this seemed not just excessive but philosophically alien. It suggested a civilization with resources so abundant that it could afford to be wasteful, a nation that could pursue total war without requiring total sacrifice from its citizens. The aircraft told the same story in a different language. Japanese pilots, increasingly desperate in the war's final year, flew planes held together with wire and prayers, burning fuel refined from pine tree roots when petroleum supplies ran low. They watched as American aircraft appeared in ever greater numbers. Sleek, powerful, maintained to specifications that seemed obsessive. If a P-51 Mustang developed an engine problem, it wasn't repaired in the field by a resourceful mechanic improvising with limited parts. It was either fixed properly with factory-fresh components, or it was scrapped and replaced. The Americans treated their aircraft like wealthy men treated shoes. When they showed wear, you discarded them and got new ones. The B-29 Superfortress, which began appearing over Japan in late 1944, embodied this philosophy of material excess. Each aircraft cost more than $600,000, a sum almost incomprehensible to Japanese planners accustomed to making do with less. The Superfortress was pressurized, allowing it to fly at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach. It bristled with defensive armament. Its crews flew missions lasting 12 or 14 hours while sitting in relative comfort. When these aircraft were damaged, they didn't limp home to be cannibalized for parts. They were repaired or replaced, and the raids continued without pause. A Japanese radar operator on the home islands, tracking the approaching bomber streams night after night, recorded his thoughts in a journal. "They come in such numbers now that tracking individual aircraft is meaningless. The sky fills with them. Where do they all come from? Do the Americans build nothing but bombers? Can their industry really produce on such a scale while still manufacturing everything else an army needs? It seems like a magic trick, but the bombs are real enough. The transformation in Japanese perception accelerated as the war drew toward its inevitable conclusion. Officers who had been taught that Western democracies were decadent and weak, that their mongrel populations lacked the unity and discipline of the Japanese race, found themselves confronting evidence that contradicted every lesson of their military education. The American military was not merely strong. It was casually, almost carelessly strong, possessing strength in such abundance that it could afford to be wasteful. This realization carried implications that extended beyond military strategy into the realm of ideology. If the Americans could build cities in the ocean, if they could feed their soldiers ice cream in combat zones, if they could replace damaged aircraft faster than they could be shot down, then perhaps the entire premise of Japanese expansion had been based on a fatal misunderstanding. Perhaps the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, justified as necessary to secure resources that the home islands lacked, had been pursuing security through conquest while failing to recognize that some nations had learned to generate abundance through means other than territorial expansion. Perhaps, and this thought was too dangerous for many to fully articulate, the American model of democratic capitalism, for all its supposed spiritual emptiness, had discovered something the Japanese Empire had not. A cruiser served as the recurring symbol in these calculations, a particular ship that came to haunt the imagination of the Japanese naval officers who learned of its story. The USS Pittsburgh lost her bow in a typhoon in June 1945, more than 500 feet of her forward structure torn away by mountainous seas. The detached bow, 700 tons of steel, remained afloat and was later towed to Guam. The Pittsburgh herself, grievously wounded, managed to steam backwards more than 1,000 miles to reach repair facilities. Within weeks, a new bow was constructed and fitted. The ship returned to service before the war's end. Japanese naval officers, reading the intelligence reports, struggled to comprehend the implications. The Americans had treated the loss of a cruiser's bow as a maintenance issue, not a catastrophic loss. They had the facilities, the materials, the expertise, and the organizational capacity to rebuild a major warship in the middle of the Pacific in a matter of weeks. A Japanese cruiser suffering similar damage would have been a total loss, its crew transferred, its hull eventually scuttled or left to rust at anchor. The Americans had turned it into a routine repair job. The cruiser became a ghost story in Japanese naval circles during the war's final months, a tale told in hushed voices that captured everything about the nature of the enemy that defied understanding. The epilogue to this story unfolded across decades of Japanese reflection on the war. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, as American occupation forces arrived with their vast supply trains, their well-fed soldiers, their casual distribution of chocolate bars and chewing gum to children, the lessons of American material abundance became impossible to ignore. The cities in the ocean had been dismantled or repurposed, but they had served their function. They had demonstrated a capacity for industrial mobilization and logistical organization that redefined what was possible in modern warfare. They had shown that geography could be overcome by engineering, that distance could be conquered by determination and resources, that the Pacific was not an impassable barrier but merely a problem to be solved. Japanese observers, many of whom would go on to lead their nation's post-war reconstruction, studied these demonstrations carefully. They learned that abundance was not merely a matter of natural resources. Japan, after all, had conquered resource-rich territories and remained impoverished. Abundance was a function of industrial organization, technological innovation, and perhaps most importantly, a social and economic system that incentivized productivity and channeled individual ambition toward collective prosperity. The cities in the ocean became, in Japanese memory, symbols of what they had been fighting against. Not merely an enemy nation, but an entire model of civilization whose productive capacity they had catastrophically underestimated. Toshio Nakamura, the captain who had stared in disbelief at Ulithi Atoll in May 1945, survived the war. In his later years, he wrote a memoir that was never widely published but was preserved in the records of the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. One passage in particular captures the psychological impact of that first glimpse of the American floating city. We had thought ourselves masters of the Pacific, and perhaps once we were. But the Americans came with their machines and their organization and their impossible abundance, and they turned the ocean into a highway, the atolls into factories. They built cities where we had thought no cities could exist. They fed their soldiers like emperors while we starved on honor and ideology. In that moment, looking at what they had built in the middle of nowhere, I understood that we had lost not just a war but an argument. They had made a claim about what was possible in the modern world, and they had proven it in steel and concrete and diesel fuel. We had made a different claim about the supremacy of spirit over matter, of discipline over abundance, of purity over mongrelization. And the ocean itself, filled with their ships and their bases and their inexhaustible supplies, stood as a refutation of everything we had believed. You cannot argue with a city in the ocean. You can only surrender to the civilization that built it and hope to learn its secrets. The cities are gone now, returned to the sea or converted to other purposes. Ulithi Atoll is quiet again, its lagoon mostly empty, its coral reefs slowly reclaiming the harbors that once held the mightiest fleet in history. But the lesson remains, encoded in history and in the memory of those who witnessed what seemed impossible. Abundance is not an accident. Freedom is not weakness. Democracy is not inefficiency. A nation of individuals, properly organized and motivated, can achieve feats that command economies and authoritarian societies cannot match, because free people solving problems voluntarily will always outproduce coerced populations working from fear. The cities in the ocean were not just military installations. They were arguments made in steel and concrete, demonstrations of what an open society can accomplish when threatened, proof that liberty and power are not opposites but allies. They were temples to a different kind of faith, not in racial purity or imperial destiny, but in human ingenuity, industrial capacity, and the simple proposition that people working together toward a common goal can transform even the ocean itself into something solid, something lasting, something real.